Now, today's lecture we will discuss the diencephalon and its different parts. Diencephalon we classify into two major parts, that is thalamencephalon and hypothalamus. Thalamencephalon is further divided into epithalamus, thalamus, and metathalamus. Epithalamus is further divided into various parts, that is habenular, nucleus, and habenular commissure. Pineal body and posterior commissure. These are subdivisions of epithalamus. Now, epithalamus. Comprising of habenular nucleus, and habenular commissure. Pineal body and posterior commissure. Pineal body is also known as pineal gland, also known as epiphysis. There are two neuroendocrine glands attached to the brain. One is the pineal body or pineal gland known as epiphysis, and the other one is hypophysis. Epiphysis are pineal body and hypophysis is the pituitary gland. So epi means upon and hypo means below. So here we are concerned with pineal body or epiphysis. Now, what are the components of the various parts of the epithalamus and its location. They are these components. They are attached to the posterior wall of third ventricle. All these major components of the epithalamus, that is habenular nucleus and habenular commissure, then pineal body and posterior commissure, they are embedded in the posterior wall of the third ventricle, or some are attached to it. Now suppose if you draw the boundaries of third ventricle and discuss the structure of posterior wall of the third ventricle. Now suppose this is roof of the third ventricle. This is the anterior wall of the third ventricle. This is floor of the third ventricle. Roof, floor, and this is the anterior wall of the third ventricle, and this is the cavity of the third ventricle. Now here is posterior wall. Now posterior wall, this is pineal body. Now it is attached to the posterior wall by peduncle or stalk. Of pineal body. When the peduncle approaches forwards, it divides into two laminae, superior lamina and inferior lamina. Superior lamina pass upwards, forming the upper part of the posterior wall of the third ventricle. Up to the roof. And inferior lamina run downwards. This is inferior lamina of the peduncle of pineal body. This is superior lamina of the peduncle of the pineal body. Now here the two laminae, they diverge and produce a small recess of the cavity of the third ventricle. This is called pineal recess. The superior lamina again bulges backwards to form another recess known as the suprapineal recess of cavity of the third ventricle. Now, in the upper part of the posterior wall of the third ventricle, there is a small triangular depression. This depression is known as the Habenular trigone. This habenular trigone is occupied by collection of neurons known as the habenular nucleus. Thus, the habenular nucleus and the bundle of commissure fibers known as the habenular commissure they are embedded here in a small triangular depression in the upper part of the posterior wall of the third ventricle. This hole is posterior wall of cavity of the third ventricle. In this habenular trigone are embedded habenular nuclei on each side, interconnected by a bundle of fibers known as the habenular commissure. Below the habenular trigone and commissure is the attachment of pineal body by its peduncle, and then its lower lamina extend downwards, and in lower part of this lower lamina again there is a bundle of commissure fibers known as the posterior commissure. So these are the features of the posterior wall of the third ventricle, tracing from above downward. Above is the habenular trigone occupied by habenular nucleus and habenular commissure. Below that is the attachment of pineal body by its peduncle to the posterior wall of the third ventricle. And still below, the lower part of the posterior wall of the third ventricle is traversed by again a bundle of commissure fibers known as the posterior commissure. So this is structural detail about the posterior wall of the third ventricle. Thus we can describe the location of these different parts of the epithalamus, habenular nucleus and habenular commissure in the habenular trigone. Then in the middle, the pineal body is attached to the posterior wall of the third ventricle by its peduncle, and below it is the posterior commissure. So this was the structure of posterior wall of the third ventricle, and different structures embedded into it and attached to it, and these structures belong to the epithalamus. Now we'll discuss these in detail one by one, starting with habenular nucleus and habenular commissure. Now I told you that the habenular nucleus is a collection of neurons and located in the habenular trigone of the upper part of the posterior wall of the third ventricle. And the nuclei of two sides are interconnected with one another by a bundle of commissure fibers known as the habenular commissure. Now what are the connections of habenular nuclei? The habenular nuclei are important nuclei, and they are connected to various structures. For example, number one, retina of the eyeball. These different connections we'll discuss later on in detail. Then it is connected with hypothalamus. connected with the hypothalamus, and with the retina it is connected by optic tracts. And with the hypothalamus, it is connected with retino-hypothalamic tract. Retino-hypothalamic tract, from the retina to the hypothalamus by means of this. Then it is also connected with the spinal cord. Habenular nuclei, they are also connected with the spinal cord via reticulospinal tracts. From reticular formation to the spinal cord, through it again the habenular nucleus is connected to the spinal cord. Then connected to the tactile nuclei. In the midbrain upper part there are nuclei known as the pretactile nuclei. So with the help of tectohabenular fibers, habenular nuclei are connected with the tactile nuclei which are in the midbrain with the help of tectohabenular fibers. Then it is connected with small brain rhinencephalon. Apart from rhinencephalon, these are also connected with the limbic system, limbic lobe, limbic system through stria medullaris thalami. Stria medullaris thalami, also known as stria habenularis. Connection with the limbic system through stria habenularis or stria medullaris thalami, and also with the pineal body. The habenular nuclei are also connected with the pineal body through habenulopineal tract. Habenulopineal tract, and it is also connected with the basal ganglion. Now, which part of the basal ganglia? Substantia nigra. Substantia nigra is an important component of basal ganglion. So it is connected with the substantia nigra, which is part of the basal ganglion. So these were different connections of the habenular nuclei. These habenular Between the habenular nuclei, there is a commissure known as the habenular commissure. The bundle of fibers which connect the two habenular nuclei, habenular commissure. Now, it is what is the composition of habenular commissure? Which type of fibers? Commissural fibers. The fibers which interconnect the habenular nuclei with one another. So commissural fibers. Then stria medullaris thalami, fibers of stria medullaris thalami. They run through the posterior commissure. Which connect the habenular nuclei with the limbic system. And then tectobulbar fibers. Tectohabenular fibers. Which connect the tectal nuclei of the midbrain with the habenular nucleus. So these are some of the fibers which constitute the habenular commissure, which run in the upper part of the posterior wall of the third ventricle. So we completed the description of the habenular nucleus and commissure. Next is the pineal body or pineal gland or epiphysis. And just I told you that it is connected by its peduncle to the posterior wall of the third ventricle. Pineal body or pineal gland. Now, pineal body, number one is attachment. So, it is attached to the posterior wall of third ventricle by its stalk or peduncle. This was about the attachment of the or location of the pineal body attached to the posterior wall of the third ventricle. Now, what is its histological structure? Structure of the pineal body. Now, outside there is a capsule. And there are cells called pinealocytes. Now these pinealocytes, they are supported by glial cells, cells with cytoplasmic processes. glial cells. Now this is just a summary of the microscopic structure of the pineal body or pineal gland. Now what are the functions? Functions of the pineal body or pineal gland. It secretes a hormone called melatonin. Synthesized and secreted by pineal body. The hormone is known as melatonin. Now, what the melatonin do? It governs the secretion of gonadal hormones from gonads, that is testis in male and ovaries in female. Testosterone released from testes in male, estrogen and progesterone released from ovary in female. So the melatonin synthesized and secreted by pineal body govern the release of these gonadal hormones, gonadal steroids. Then it also induces sleep. Melatonin induces sleep. This is why melatonin is also known as sleep hormone. Now, if you have trouble sleeping, then you must take bananas, because bananas are the natural source of melatonin that will help you to induce sleep. Then also control appetite. So these are some of the known functions of the pineal body. That is, control the secretion of gonads, mean male, female. Second, it also induces sleep, thus also known as sleep hormone. And then it also controls appetite. Now, what is mode of action of melatonin? The major sensory signal which stimulate pineal body is darkness. Light and darkness. So light and darkness control the secretion of melatonin from pineal body, and the major stimulant signal is darkness. So darkness stimulate pineal body, therefore with result more melatonin is secreted by pineal body. And what is the action of melatonin on the gonads? Melatonin depress the gonads. The stimulus is darkness. It stimulates the pineal body. When the pineal body is stimulated, it secretes more melatonin. Therefore, blood level of melatonin is increased. And what is the action of melatonin on the gonads? It is inhibitory. Melatonin inhibits the gonads. Therefore, there will be low level of male and female sex hormones, low level of testosterone in male, and low level of estrogen, progesterone in female. Now, light inhibit the pineal body, and when the pineal body is inhibited by light, then there will be low secretion of melatonin. By pineal body. Therefore, blood level of the melatonin will be reduced. When the blood level of melatonin, which is reduced, and you know that melatonin is depressing the gonads, but here because there is low level of melatonin, but therefore the gonads will be free. To secrete sex steroids. So there will be high level of sex hormones in the blood. So this is how the pineal body is affected by light and darkness. So the function of melatonin and the gonad is inhibitory, and the action of darkness on the pineal body is to stimulate. So when the body is exposed to darkness, then the pineal body will be stimulated. When the pineal body is stimulated, there will be more melatonin secreted. And what is the action of melatonin on the gonads? It is inhibitory. Therefore, when there is more melatonin in circulation, it will inhibit the gonads. Therefore, there will be little amount of sex steroids in the blood. Reverse is in the case of light. When somebody is exposed to light, what is the effect of light on the pineal body? Light inhibits the pineal body. When the light inhibits the pineal body, melatonin secretion will be reduced. There will be low level of melatonin in the blood. When there is low level of melatonin in the blood, therefore the gonads will be free to secrete sex steroids in the blood, and more amount of testosterone, estrogen, progesterone will be in the blood. So this is how the pineal body work in response to darkness and light. Now in developed countries, the age of puberty is earlier as compared to the backward countries. It is because in developed countries the people are more exposed to light, sunlight, and then artificial light late hours in the night. So the period of light exposure is more to the people in developed countries. This is why that their melatonin level is lower in the blood for a greater period of time, and the gonads will secrete sex steroids more. This will cause puberty to appear earlier as compared to the backward countries where they are less exposed to the light. In the villages, etc., they from daylight, then they go to their homes at night early, and then early they go to the bed to sleep. Therefore, they are less exposed to the light. This is why that there will be more melatonin level, and with the result, the gonads will be depressed, and the secondary sexual characteristic will appear comparatively late as compared to the developed countries. So this was briefly about the functions and mode of action of the pineal body. Now, what is the pineal sympathetic arc? Next topic. Pineal sympathetic arc. The nerves pathway. Oh, this is cerebrum. Then midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, which is continued as spinal cord. Now here is the attachment of pineal body. Cut section through corpus callosum. Fornix, septum pellucidum. Anteriorly is the anterior commissure. Then lamina terminalis, optic chiasma. Tuber cinereum and hypophysis are pituitary gland. Mammillary body. Now, anterior commissure lamina terminalis form the anterior wall of the third ventricle, and here is posterior wall, habenular trigone. Then peduncle of the pineal body. Posterior wall of the third ventricle. Here is habenular commissure, pineal body. and then here is posterior commissure. Now the eyeballs. Then right and left optic nerves, optic chiasma, and right and left optic tracts. Optic tract. This is the retina of the eyeball. Then lateral geniculate body, right and left side, and then optic radiation and optic and visual center, not shown in this diagram. Optic tracts. Now the optic tract divide into lateral root and medial root. Now this is a medial root of the optic tract. Now the fibers, nerve fibers, which supply the pineal body, they pass through the medial root of the optic tract and lay in the hypothalamus. This is suppose hypothalamus. So these fibers from the medial root of the optic tract relay in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of hypothalamus. Now these fibers from the medial root and relay in the hypothalamus. This fiber tract is known as retinohypothalamic tract. Retinohypothalamic tract. The fibers separating from the optic tract pass through the medial root of the optic tract and relay into the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. These fibers are known as the retinohypothalamic tract, from retina to the hypothalamus. This is suppose hypothalamus. Then these fibers from the hypothalamus enter the midbrain, where they make connection with the reticular formation. With the reticular formation of the midbrain. These fibers are known as the hypothalamo-reticular fibers. Hypothalamo-reticular fibers. Then the fibers continue downward to pass through the pons, medulla oblongata, and this is spinal cord. Medulla oblongata, spinal cord. Spinal cord, this is cervical region of the spinal cord, and this is thoracic region and lumbosacral regions. So from the reticular formation of the midbrain, the fibers descend passing through the pons, medulla oblongata, cervical part of the spinal cord to reach the T1 segment, first thoracic segment, where they relay T1 spinal segment. These fibers which arise from the reticular formation descend through the pons, medulla oblongata, all the cervical spinal segment, enter the thoracic part of the spinal cord, relay in the lateral horn of T1. Lateral horn of first thoracic spinal segment. These fibers are known as the reticulospinal tracts. Reticulospinal fibers from the reticular formation of the midbrain to the spinal cord. Reticulospinal fibers. Then parallel to the spinal cord is sympathetic trunk, right and left sympathetic trunk, over which there are sympathetic ganglia. This is suppose first cervical, C1 sympathetic ganglion, second, third, and then thoracic, lumbar, sacral, sympathetic ganglia on the sympathetic trunk. This is C1 that is first cervical sympathetic ganglion. So from the lateral horn of the T1 spinal segment, these fibers enter the sympathetic trunk, thoracic part, and these fibers continue to ascend through the sympathetic trunk and relay in the first cervical sympathetic ganglion and relay there. From the lateral horn of the T1, these fibers enter the sympathetic trunk and they ascend through the sympathetic trunk without relay in sympathetic ganglia, but ultimately when they reach the first cervical sympathetic ganglia, here these relay. So because these fibers are before relay in the sympathetic ganglion, these are known as the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Preganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers. Then they relay in the first cervical sympathetic ganglion. And relay here, and from it postganglionic sympathetic fibers arise. Postganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers arise from the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion. Now these postganglionic sympathetic fibers then enter the cranial cavity through carotid canal along the internal carotid artery. You know the internal carotid artery enter the cranial cavity through carotid canal. So these postganglionic sympathetic fibers, they follow the course of internal carotid artery to enter the cranial cavity. This is suppose the carotid canal. The norma basilis of the skull. Carotid canal, foramen lacerum, and then enter the cranial cavity. Then this postganglionic sympathetic fibers, when enter the cranial cavity, they pass through the tentorium cerebelli, enter the tentorium cerebelli. A dural fold. And here these postganglionic sympathetic fibers have a special name, nervus conari. The postganglionic sympathetic fibers, while traversing through the tentorium cerebelli in the cranial cavity, is known as the nervus coronae. Now, these fibers relay in the habenular nucleus. This is suppose habenular nucleus. And from the habenular nucleus, these fibers enter the pineal body and innervate it. Now the fibers which arise from the habenular nucleus and relay in the pineal body are known as habenulo-pineal tract. Habenulo-pineal tract. This is the sympathetic arc which supply the pineal body. So from the medial root of the optic, from retina, the fibers run through the optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract. These fibers follow the medial route of the optic tract and relay in the thalamus. This part of the pathway is known as the retino-hypothalamic tract, from retina to the hypothalamus. Then from the hypothalamus, these fibers descend to enter the midbrain, where they relay into the reticular formation of the midbrain. From the reticular formation of the midbrain, the reticulospinal tracts arise. Why? Because these fibers arise from the reticular formation and descending through the pons, medulla oblongata, then cervical part of the spinal cord, they relay in the lateral horn of the T1 spinal segment, first thoracic spinal segment, lateral horn, which is sympathetic, which is occupied by sympathetic neurons. Then from the lateral horn of the T1, these fibers enter into the sympathetic trunk. Sympathetic trunk. These fibers, they pass upwards to the sympathetic trunk without relay. Ultimately, when they reach the first cervical sympathetic ganglion, here they relay. These fibers before the first cervical sympathetic ganglia are known as the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Preganglionic sympathetic fibers. From the first cervical sympathetic ganglion, then postganglionic sympathetic fibers arise. Postganglionic sympathetic fibers arise, which enter the cranial cavity along with the internal carotid artery, because the internal carotid artery enter the cranial cavity to supply the brain, etc. Through carotid canal. On reaching the carotid canal, these postganglionic sympathetic fibers, they enter the tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium cerebelli, a dural fold between cerebrum and cerebellum. And while running through the tentorium cerebelli, these postganglionic sympathetic fibers have a special name, nervus coronari. And from these nerves then enter the habenular nucleus, which is in the upper part of the posterior wall of the third ventricle. From the habenular nucleus, a tract arises which enter into the pineal body ultimately. These fiber tracts between habenular nucleus and pineal body is known as the habenulo-pineal tract. This is the whole pathway, and this is the sympathetic innervation of the pineal body. The parasympathetic innervation is not yet discovered. Now, just to brief this pathway, it appears to be complicated, but it is not much complicated. So, from retina of the eyeball, these impulses follow the optic tract From optic tract they follow the medial route of optic tract. And these fibers relay in the hypothalamus. In which nucleus of hypothalamus? In the suprachiasmatic nucleus located just above the optic chiasma, nucleus of the hypothalamus. Now these fibers originating from the retina to the hypothalamus, they are known as the retinohypothalamic. Retinohypothalamic tract. From the hypothalamus, these fibers continue, enter the midbrain, where they get communication with the reticular formation. Reticular formation of midbrain. Now these fibers which arise from the hypothalamus, and then they are communicated with reticular formation. They are known as the reticulohypothalamic fibers. Reticulohypothalamic fibers. From the reticular formation of the midbrain, the fibers arise which descend through the brainstem, enter the spinal cord, descend through the cervical spinal segments, and then relay in the T1. Lateral horn of first thoracic spinal segment. First lateral horn of first thoracic spinal segment. Now these fibers which arise from the reticular formation and relay in the spinal cord are known as the reticulospinal fibers. Reticulospinal fibers. from the first cervical sympathetic, from the first thoracic spinal segment, not first cervical, from the first thoracic spinal segment. Then these fibers continue to enter the sympathetic trunk and relay in the first cervical sympathetic ganglion. First cervical sympathetic ganglion. So before relay in the first cervical sympathetic ganglion, these fibers are labeled as the pre-ganglionic sympathetic fibers. Pre-ganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers. From the first cervical ganglion, these fibers are known as the post-ganglionic sympathetic fibers. Post-ganglionic sympathetic fibers. They relay in the Habenular nuclei. From the Habenular nucleus, these fibers relay in the pineal body. Relay in the pineal body. Ultimately, they reach the pineal body, and these fibers are known as the habenulo-pineal tract. Habenulo-pineal tract. So this is just a summary of this pathway. Easy to remember, it is not difficult. And this is the figure which will explain this pathway. So I will again rush through it. From the retina, the nerve fibers arise, run through the optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract. These fibers for the pineal body leave the optic tract through its medial route and relay in the hypothalamus. These fibers which leave the optic tract and enter the hypothalamus, they are known as the retino-hypothalamic tract. Retino-hypothalamic tract. From the hypothalamus, these fibers descend to enter the reticular formation of the midbrain, and these fibers from hypothalamus to the reticular formation known as the hypothalamo-reticular fibers. From the reticular formation, these fibers run through the remaining part of the brainstem, descend through the cervical segment of the spinal cord, and reaches the thoracic segment. In the lateral half of the first thoracic spinal segment, these fibers are relayed, and these fibers from reticular formation to the T1 spinal segment known as the reticulospinal fibers. From the lateral horn of the T1, these preganglionic fibers enter the nearby sympathetic trunk. These fibers ascend without relay to the sympathetic trunk, and when they reaches the first cervical sympathetic ganglia, here they relay. From here, the post-ganglionic sympathetic fibers arise, which enter the cranial cavity through carotid canal via internal carotid artery. When they reach the cranial cavity, they run through the tentorium cerebelli. Here, these post-ganglionic fibers, sympathetic fibers, is given a special name known as the nervus coronari, and these nervus coronari relay in the habenular nucleus. which is in the upper part of the posterior wall with third ventricle. From the habenular nucleus, again these fibers arise and ultimately enter the pineal body. These fibers are known as the habenulo-pineal tract. This is the sympathetic pathway which innervate the pineal body. As I told you that parasympathetic pathway is not known. This was about the pathway of innervation of the pineal body. A summary and also a diagram which will help to describe these different nerve fibers and stations ultimately reaching the pineal body. Now the applied aspect already we discussed. Of pineal body. While we were discussing the external features, I told you that in old age usually the pineal body is calcified. So this calcified pineal body in X-ray of the head region will show an opacity in the center. This opacity caused by calcified pineal body is known as brain sand. Now normally this opacity is in the midline, but if there is some space occupying lesion, suppose this is posterior view, X-ray view of the skull, and inside is the brain. This is brain, cerebellum, right cerebellum hemisphere, left cerebellum hemisphere inside, and the opacity will be in the midline. This is normal. But when there is some space occupying lesion, accumulation of pus or blood or any other fluid in the cranial cavity, it will push the brain to one side. Therefore, this opacity is shifted to one side, and we can see this radio-opaque opacity of the calcified pineal body located not in the center but to one side. This will help to demonstrate that there is some space occupying material inside the cranial cavity or not, pushing the brain to one side. This was about the applied aspect of the pineal body. Now we finish with the description of habenular nucleus and its commissure. Then we talk about the pineal body in detail. Now posterior commissure, it is located in the lower part of posterior wall of the third ventricle. These are commissural fibers which connect the various structures of each cerebral hemisphere. These fibers, number one, connect the habenular nuclei. Number two, they also connect the posterior commissure nuclei and the interstitial nucleus of caudal. Interstitial nucleus of caudal. So commissural fibers which interconnect the habenular nuclei with one another, which interconnect the Rhinencephalon, not habenular, rhinencephalon each side. And number 2, some nuclei like posterior commissure nuclei and interstitial nuclei of Kajal. So where these nuclei are, these 2 nuclei, they are in the midbrain. Suppose if we cut a section of the midbrain, at the level of superior calculus, midbrain traversed by the cerebral aqueduct, and this is section at the level of superior colliculus, right or left, and these superior calculi are because of nucleus of the superior calculus on each side. Then the cerebral aqueduct is covered by a central gray matter. This is cerebral aqueduct surrounded by central gray matter. Then 2 crus cerebri, and this is substantia nigra. So anterolateral to the cerebral aqueduct in the central gray matter are oculomotor nerve nuclei. Oculomotor nerve nucleus, 1 on each side. Now in the interior part of the gray matter, dorsolateral to the oculomotor nerve nuclei, here are interstitial nuclei of Kajal on each side, and nuclei of the posterior commissure. Interstitial nucleus of Kajal, and this is the posterior commissure nucleus. On each side. So the fibers connecting these nuclei pass through the posterior commissure. So this was about the posterior commissure, and with this we finished with the detailed structure of the epithalamus. Now above is the epithalamus, which comprises of the habenular commissure and habenular nuclei. Then below it is the pineal body attached by pineal stalk, and still below in the posterior wall of third ventricle is the posterior commissure. So all these components we discussed, components of epithalamus. Then below the epithalamus is thalamus, and then metathalamus. That will be the next topic of our discussion, and ultimately we will discuss the hypothalamus. Thank you very much.